أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على إمام القبلتين ونبي الحرمين وأفضل الثقلين وجد الحسن والحسين الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الصادقين المنتخبين المظلومين والذين ذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا اللهم صل وسلم وزد وبارك على صاحب الدعوة النبوية والسولة الحيدرية والإسمة الفاطمية والحلم الحسنية والشجاعة الحسينية والعبادة السجادية والمآثر الباقرية والآثار الجعفرية والعلوم الكاذمية والحجج الردبية والجود التقوية والنقابة النقبية والهيبة العسكرية والغيبة الإلهية اللهم عجل فرجه وسهل مخرجه أما بعد فقد قال الله في كتابه الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء ويجعلكم خلفاء الأرض صدق الله العلي العظيم. Before we begin the majlis, if those who are not against the wall, if we could gather together a little bit. If you're on the wall, no problem, you're fine. The loudest of your salawats ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the love of Fatima al-Zahra in particular, a second salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the hastening of the reappearance of the master of our time, a louder salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The verse in question is a verse that each and every one of you have heard. And it's a verse which many of you have memorized. That when you go through difficulty in your life, you recite this verse. When there is a member of your community who is ill, you recite this verse. When you have hardships, you recite this verse. And that verse is none other than Surah An-Naml, chapter 27, verse number 62. Within this verse, we find that there are a number of important discussions that come up when we begin to examine this verse. From the first level, this verse, it demonstrates to us that what is the true nature of dua. Number two, you find that it explains that what should a person do when he is afflicted with hardship. But at the third level, when we examine this the narrations, we find that this verse has an immense connection with the Imam of our time according to the narrations of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Now when it comes to this ayat, of course the translation of this ayat is Amma yujibul muttarra idha da'ahu wa yakshifu su. The first phrase Amma, which is actually Amman, but because the letter Ya follows the Noon, we reduce the sound of the noon, is asking the question that who is it that answers the dua of the person who is mudhtar and distressed when he calls upon him, and when that distressed individual calls upon Allah, Allah removes that evil which is afflicted on that individual. You see, at the first level of this discussion, when you examine the tafsir of this ayat is saying that Allah answers the dua of the individual who is distressed. Now the question naturally arises that what is a distressed person? That in other words, what is the definition of a person who is mudtar? And the reason why this definition is important is because this ayat is saying that if you are truly mudtar, then Allah will answer your dua. In other words, this ayat is an explanation of another ayat. There is an ayat of the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 186. Within that ayat, Allah He says, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي أَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةُ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ. That when my servant asks about me, tell them I am near. And I answer the dua of the one who supplicates to me. In this ayat, Allah is saying that a true dua, al-dua al-hakiki, is never rejected by Allah. But you and I, we have the experience that oftentimes we make dua for a number of things, but at the outward level, that dua, it doesn't come into fruition. So you find that Allah is saying that although a true dua is not rejected, to understand the etiquette of a true dua, you have to come to this ayat, Surah An-Naml, chapter 27, verse 62. And in this ayat, Allah is saying that if you want to be an individual who supplicates to Him truly, then you need to be an individual who is mudtar, an individual who is distressed. You see, you and I, when we make dua to Allah, in reality, yes, we are turning to Allah, but our hope is on all of the means that God has created, and there is nothing wrong with that. But you find an individual who is truly mudtar, an individual who is truly distressed, is an individual that all of the apparent means of this world have been cut off. He has tried medium after medium. And when each of those mediums fails, a time it comes where he has none but Allah to turn towards. Doesn't Amir al-Mu'mineen in Dua al-Kumail say, Ilahi man li ghayruk? That, oh my Lord, who do I have besides you? You see, at the level of tafsir, the Quran over here is showing that an individual, when all of these paths are closed, and he is truly distressed when he calls upon Allah, Allah does not leave that individual who is alone. You see, this explains to us what the reality of dua is. You know, if I were to take a survey in this hall and I asked you, what is dua? The vast majority will say dua is when you call upon Allah when you're in need, and Allah, He gives you your hajat. But if you look at what does the word dua mean, the word dua in the Arabic language comes from the verb da'a yad'u. And da'a yad'u, literally, it means to call upon Allah. That is why when we look at the hadith of Ahlul Bayt, the hadith of Ahlul Bayt show a reality to dua that you and I, we don't understand dua in the same way. There's a tradition where the imams will say, ad-dua huwa al-ibadah. That dua is worship, but then there is another narration where the fifth imam says, ad-dua mukhul ibadah. That dua is the core of your worship. And I've translated it as core, but the word mukh in the Arabic language is the part of the brain which is the most essential to the life of a human being. Now, I won't go into the medical terminology, whether it is the spinal cord, whether it is something else. It's outside of my realm of expertise. But whatever the most essential part of the brain is, you find that you call it mukh in the Arabic language. So over here, the imams are describing that dua to your worship is so essential that it is like the most essential part of your brain. Why? Because dua in its essence means to call upon Allah. You know, when you go to salat, when you go to saum, when you give khums, when you do all of these different things, there are structured rules that when you do it, you stand in this manner, and you recite in this manner, and you do ruku in this manner, and you give khums over here. You fast in this manner. But dua from the fiqh perspective does not have structured rules. In one sense, it is the most unadulterated ibadah of Allah that, O human being, in whatever way you call upon me, call upon me. Now, yes, there is adab and etiquette which is mentioned in the hadith, but it is saying, O human being, in whatever manner you call upon me, call upon me. To the extent that one narration, one hadith al-Qudsi, it is mentioned that Allah says to the Prophet Musa, O Musa, salni kullama tahtaju ilay, hatta alfa shatik wa milha ajinik. That, O Musa, ask me for whatever you need. Even that grass which you need for your sheep, and that salt which you need for the dough of your bread, ask me. In other words, Allah is saying, O Musa, there is nothing which is too small when it comes to my doorstep. And when Allah accepts and gives it to you, then it is not something which is small, because the value is not in the item, but the value is in the one who is giving it. You know, if Amir al-Mu'mineen was in front of us, if Imam al-Hussein was in front of us, even if they gave us a penny or they gave us something small, we would consider it our greatest possession. Why? Not because of the value of the item in and of itself, but the barakah and the blessing that the one who gave it to me is Ali ibn Abi Talib. The one who gave it to me is Sayyid al-Shuhada. Now when Allah gives it to you, who is the one who is bestowing? So when Allah gives you something, then it is necessary that you respect that thing. And you find the source of that giving is dua. So the ayat that says, Amma yujibul muddarra idha da'ahu wa yakshifu su. When somebody truly calls upon Allah, the first result is that Allah removes evil from that person. But the second result, the ayat that continues, you know, normally we don't finish the rest of the ayat. But the next part of the ayat that says, وَيَجْعَلُكُمْ خُلَفَاءَ الْأَرْضِ, that we are making you the khulafa of Allah upon this earth, or the successors of Allah upon this earth. Now when we come to the second part of this discussion, there are many traditions which at one level say that the mudthar in this ayat is Imam al-Zaman. You know, there are certain ulama, their opinion is that Imam al-Zaman is the one who is being addressed in this ayat. For example, a famous contemporary scholar who has this opinion is Sayyid Munir al-Khabbaz. But no, there are other ulama, the second opinion is this, is that at the level of tafsir, mudthar and distressed is a person for whom all pathways are closed and he calls upon Allah. But Imam al-Zaman is the misdaq and the application of this ayat. In that way, there is no contradiction between the hadith and the tafsir. And over here, we have a narration of the fifth Imam, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, where the Imam, he says, هذه الآية نزلت في القائم عليه السلام, that this verse was revealed in regards to the Qayem, as an application, as a misdaq, as a referent. And then he says, Huwa wallahi, that by Allah, He is the one, إِذَا صَلَّ فِي الْمَقَامِ وَدَعَا اللَّهَ فَأَجَابَهُ. He is the one that when he returns and he prays by the maqam of Nabi Ibrahim, Allah will accept his dua, and you find that Allah will raise his flags after that. You see, when you look at this ayat, one example that shows that the Imam of our time is a mistaq and an application of this ayat is that this ayat, it says, يَجْعَلُكُمْ خُلَفَاءَ الْأَرْضِ. Notice the expression. It says, خُلَفَاءَ الْأَرْضِ, that we are making you the vicegerents of the earth. You know, there are many verses in the Quran that talk about God's vicegerency and khilafah upon the earth. But when you look at the expression over there is very different. For example, when it talks about Nabi Adam, and Nabi Adam is the representation for all of humanity. In other words, we are making insan a khalifa, but the best representation is Allah's Prophet. It says, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa, that upon this earth you are a caliph. Ya Dawood, inna ja'alnaka khalifatan fil ard, that upon this earth you are a caliph. But over here it is not saying khulafa fil ard, but it is saying khulafa al ard. Al ard means that we are making you the successors, the inheritors, the representatives, the vicegerents of the entire earth. In other words, when it comes to the ummah of Rasulullah, Allah is giving a promise that, O ummah of my final prophet, a day will come when you will succeed and be the representatives upon this entire earth. Such a day has not come yet. Such a day has not come where Islam has prevailed over all of the lands. So you find this will only occur in the time of the 12th of Ali Muhammad. So in this way, you find that this ayat has an ishara to an immense link with the Imam of our time. Now the question is that if we are going to understand this ayah truly, then we need to understand what the reality of the 12th Imam is. You see, if it was the other A'immah assuming that they were open in front of us, because many of us, we have this misconception that if we lived in the times of the Imams would be easily accessible. But historical reality shows the opposite. Imam Musa al-Kadhim spends 14 years in prison. Imam al-Askari, house arrest. Imam Ali al-Hadi, the situation is restricted. Even in the other A'immah, Imam al-Sadiq, Imam al-Baqir, who had more freedom in comparison, there were many companions who were in Basra and Kufa. They did not meet the Imam every single day. So even if you were there in the time of the Imam, there's no guarantee that you would have direct access to him. But for those who did, they would interact with the Imam. They would discuss with the Imam. And based on that, they would get to know the Imam. But the question is, for us, in this period of Al-Ghaybatul Kubra, the major occultation, how do we know the reality of the 12th Imam, that whom is this individual? And in one way, you find that there is a famous narration which each and every one of you have heard. And that narration, it says, Awwaluna Muhammad, Akhiruna Muhammad, Awsatuna Muhammad, wa kulluna Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. That the first of us is like Rasulullah. The middle of us is like Rasulullah. The last of us is like Rasulullah. In reality, if you want to understand us, we are a manifestation of our grandfather Rasulullah. Thus, if you understand Rasulullah, you'll understand the 12th Imam. And if you understand the 12th Imam, you'll understand Rasulullah. And this can only be done when you examine the connection between the 12th Imam and Rasulullah, which is the subject of analysis tonight, stemming off from the ayat that I've taken. Now, when it comes to this discussion, the first connection between the 12th Imam and Rasulullah is that both of them have been described as being sent by Allah. And I'll tell you what the importance is to this coming shortly. When you look in the Quran, in Surah Al-Jumu'ah, chapter 62, verses 6 and 7, هُوَ الَّذِي بَعَثَ فِي الْأُمِّيِّينَ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَإِنْ كَانُوا مِنْ قَبْلُ لَفِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ. That we sent this prophet. The word sent is described with the word ba'ata in the Arabic language. The word ba'ata means to send. This word, which the Quran uses to describe Rasulullah, Rasulullah uses this exact same word in a hadith to describe the 12th Imam. You know what that hadith it says? لو لم يبق من الدنيا إلا يوم لبعث الله رجلا من أهل بيتي. That if there was a day that was left, there was only one day upon this earth, then surely Allah would send a rajul from my Ahlul Bayt. You see, the emphasis is on the word rajul over here. That in other words, what other famous hadith do we have where Rasulullah uses the word rajul? The only other hadith we have in this context of describing an individual, particular individual, is when on the day of Khaybar, Rasulullah, he said, لَأُعْتِيَنَّ الرَّايَةَ غَدًا رَجُلًا كَرَّارًا وَغَيْرَ فَرَّارٍ يُحِبُّ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَيُحِبُّهُ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ. That tomorrow I am going to give the flag to a rajul and a man. In other words, when the word rajul was used on the day of Khaybar to describe Ali ibn Abi Talib, and the word rajul is being used to the 12th Imam, Rasulullah is demonstrating that that rajul who comes at the end of times will be like that rajul and that man who was on the day of Khaybar. And the qualities of the one who was on the day of Khaybar is that he was number one, karrar and brave. Number two, he was ghayr farrar, he didn't run away. Number three was that he loved Allah and His Prophet. And number four, Allah and His Prophet loved that individual. You know, the goal of Islamic spirituality, Irfan, is for you to love Allah and for you to become the beloved of Allah. If there is anyone in history whose love for the Prophet was certified on the tongue of Risala, and the love of Allah for that individual was certified on the tongue of Risala, then it is none other than Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And in that way, that quality is in Amir al-Mu'mineen. You find that quality is in the 12th Imam. Ya Ali. So you find in the first connection between the 12th Imam and Rasulullah is that they have been described as being sent by Allah. The second connection between these two individuals is that both of them have been awaited in history. Now many of you may say that it makes sense that the 12th Imam is being awaited. After all, one of his titles is Al-Muntadar. But what do we mean when we say that Rasulullah was awaited? You see, there is a verse of the Quran that says, هُوَ الَّذِي آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابَ يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. That those individuals that we have given the book, they recognize the Prophet Muhammad like they recognize their own children. In other words, they have been given so many alamat and signs of this final prophet that in the way that they would recognize their own children, they recognize whom this personality will be. You know, when you look historically, there is no reason for the Jews to be in the Arabian Peninsula, and in particular in Medina historically. That the Jews, you find, that Arabia was not an original hold for them. That they were in the regions of modern-day Palestine, for example, in the regions of modern-day Jordan, and in the regions of North Africa. But there was not a historical reason for them to migrate to a barren area like the Arabian Peninsula. But you find that our traditions, they allude that the only reason which is possible these individuals would have moved is because they heard that that final prophet will come in Arabia. You know, when you look in the Bible today, the Bible, of course, is a word which we use and we oversimplify it. But in reality, what we call the Bible is the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Psalms. And you find that the Jews, they just believe in the Old Testament, and the Christians believe in the New Testament as well. When you go to the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy, in the 18th book, in the 18th line, even in the Old Testament, there's a very interesting line. And that line is addressing the prophet Moses. And it says that we will send a prophet like you unto their brethren. Musa is from the lineage of Ishaq. He is from the lineage of Isaac. Who are the brethren of the children of Isaac? The brethren of the children of Isaac are the children of Ismail. In other words, that prophet which is to come will be from the lineage of Ismail, number one. Number two, we will send a prophet like you. In other words, Musa was a prophet who was Sahib al-Sharia. That Musa brought a codex of law. Is there a prophet who claims in the lineage of Ismail that they brought law? Isa didn't bring a law. But Isa brought the spirit of the law. If there is anyone in the lineage of Ismail after Musa who claimed to bring a Sharia, it is none other than a Rasulullah. But you find the line after that says something more ajib. The line after that, it says that I will place my words within that mouth, the mouth of that prophet. In other words, what he will say will be of my revelation. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى وَمَا يَنْتَقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى. That this prophet will not speak of his own desires, but when he speaks, it'll be of the revelation of Allah. So you find in this reality, Rasulullah was awaited in history, the 12th Imam is awaited in history. You know, when you look across the various religious traditions of the world, you find that each of them has the concept of a Messiah, whether it is the Jews, whether it is the Christians with the second coming of Christ, whether it is the Buddhists with the final incarnation of the Buddha. But I'll say even something which is more strange. Even the atheist is waiting for Imam al-Zaman. Now you may say to me, the atheist doesn't believe in God, much less the 12th Imam. How can that atheist wait for the 12th Imam? You see, every human being, whether they believe in God or not, you find that they have hope that the future will be better, that their children will live in a better world that they lived in a world where their problems will be solved. In that way, that hope which is in the hearts of humanity, the reality of that hope is Sahib al-Zaman. So you find at the second level, the second connection between Rasulullah and the 12th Imam is that both of them were awaited. The third level which connects both of these individuals in this analysis, otherwise this is a whole ashra on its own, is that their methodology is similar. Now over here, we find a question that comes up. Oftentimes, the picture which is painted on the manabir of Imam al-Zaman is only one set of narrations. And those set of narrations, they state that when the Imam comes, the sword will be flying, heads left and right, blood and gore. You've heard many of these narrations, and we can't deny those narrations. Those narrations, they exist. But there is also another set of narrations. And those other set of narrations, when they describe the 12th Imam, they describe that his seerah will be the same as the seerah of his grandfather Rasulullah. For example, the 6th Imam very famously says, Yasiru fin nas bisirat jaddihi Rasulullah. That when he acts, his methodology will be the same methodology as Rasulullah. Now when we examine the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, did the Prophet Muhammad, from day one in Mecca, begin to do offensive war and take out his sword and begin to attack the kuffar of Quraysh, or did he do something else? The Prophet Muhammad, if you examine his biography, he gradually propagated the message of Islam, and that's a lesson for us. You know, oftentimes when many of us become religious, we want to make the jump and tell the entire community. But no, when Rasulullah was there, وَأَنذِرْ عَشِيرَتَكَ الْأَقْرَبِينَ. First go and tell your kinfolks. Then after that, you find the circle, it grew. Then Rasulullah was told openly, announced to everyone. And in that manner, Rasulullah first engaged with the community. And when he would engage and they denied God's hujjah, only then were other methodologies used. In the same way, when we examine the second set of narrations, it shows that Imam al-Zaman will do the same thing. For example, one narration from Imam al-Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. It says, not from Imam al-Sadiq, from Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salam, I stand corrected, which is found in Bihar al-Anwar. Imam Ali alayhi salam says that when the 12th Imam he comes, when Al-Qayem he comes, he will call the head of the Jews and the Christians. And when he calls the heads of the Jews and the Christians, he will answer their questions from their books. And when he answers the questions from their books, you find that they will accept Islam. Over here, this hadith is showing that the Imam is an individual who will engage with others who are in society, number one. Number two, we have another narration. And that narration, it states that one individual comes to Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. When he comes to Imam as-Sadiq, he says, "Oh Imam, you have all of these Shia in Khurasan, why don't you uprise against the government of the time?" The Imam at that point, he says that do the wealthy help the needy? And do those in power help those who are weakened? When the man says no, the Imam says in the time of Al-Qayem, a brother will be able to reach into the pocket of another believer and take what he needs without being asked. Now, I'm not saying that reach into the pocket of your neighbor and take his wallet, but I'm saying that there will be so much rahmah amongst the believers that if one were to do that, there would be no adverse reaction. I know many of you, if somebody reaches for your wallet, the first reaction is, something not positive. But that is what that society was. And this was the seerah of Rasulullah. You see, the Orientalists, when you look at the Orientalist representation of Rasulullah, whether it was in the 1700s and individuals like Goldzier then, or whether it's like Michael Cook at Princeton over there, you find that they've attacked Rasulullah in many different ways. But the one thing which they could not attack the Prophet Muhammad in is that he took a society that was so deeply embedded in tribalism and they turned them into a true community of brethren. That is something which is magnificent. There's a verse of the Quran which says, وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ. That the believers are those individuals, they prefer others to themselves even if they are in need. On the day of Tabuk, it's stated, there was a man who was dying of thirst. One person goes to give him water. He says, give it to the person next to me. When he takes the water to the second, he says, give it to the third. The third says, give it to the fourth. Give it to the fifth, sixth, seventh. When he reaches the seventh man says, no, go and give it to the first person. The person with the water, when he goes to the first, he finds that he's died. The second dies, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh. At that moment, this ayat was revealed on Rasulullah. And it says, وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ. We talk in all of these lectures about the return of the Imam. The reality of the Imam's return is that he will create that unity within the community. When Janab Zahra stands up, she gives her famous khutbah of Fadak. Fatimatu Zahra salamullahi alayha. She says our imamat is to bring the community together. So the third connection between the 12th Imam and Rasulullah is that their methodology is similar. But the fourth and final connection in this analysis is that both of them placed a great emphasis on remembering Imam al-Hussein. You're aware of the traditions of Rasulullah, that Rasulullah is on the mimbar, Imam al-Hussein is in the masjid. Rasulullah gets off the mimbar, he picks up his grandson, he returns to the mimbar. And when everyone is looking that why is it that this man, he took his grandson, he says, Hada Husaynun fa'rifuhu wansuruhu. That this is Hussein, recognize him and support him. But this is Rasulullah, the traditions are plenty, you know the traditions. But when it comes to Imam al-Zaman's remembrance of his grandfather, there is one ziyarah in this regard which is truly unique. And that ziyarah is known as Ziyaratul Nahiya. In Ziyaratul Nahiya, you are not hearing the masayib of Imam al-Hussein from Amini Zakir. You are listening to the masayib of Imam al-Hussein from the grandson of Imam al-Hussein. Oftentimes people, they ask questions about the maqtal. That how do we know how many wounds were on the body of Imam al-Hussein? Was there anyone to count? The reason we know it is because the Imams of Ahlul Bayt told us. Imam Zainul Abidin, Imam al-Sadiq. There's an important question before I come to Masayib. I'm not coming towards it yet. But one question before I go into the text of Ziyaratul Nahiya very briefly is that many people, they ask this question, that if everyone died on the side of Imam al-Hussein, who narrated the event of Ashura? When Imam al-Hussein has a dialogue with Sayyida Zainab in the tent, Who was in the tent to listen and record that dialogue? You see, when it comes to the narrators of Karbala, there are four important groups. The first group are those who are on the side of Yazid. Hamid ibn Muslim or Humayd ibn Muslim, whose name you often hear in Masaib, was an individual who was a scribe of battle that was employed by the Umayyads. And actually, Hamid ibn Muslim is that individual who carried the head of Imam al-Hussein on the 11th of Muharram to Kufa. So you find this is one group. The second group, of course, is the women of Ali Muhammad. The third group is that there were many individuals, there were a handful of individuals who were on the side of Imam al-Hussein, but they were not martyred on the day of Ashura. Somebody like Hassan ibn Hassan al-Mutanna. Hassan ibn Hassan al-Mutanna was wounded on that day. He was taken to Kufa. He is one narrator. Another individual is an individual by the name of Uqba ibn Sam'an or Aqaba ibn Sam'an. It can be pronounced either way. Uqba ibn Sam'an was the slave of Rabab, the wife of Imam al-Hussein, the mother of Ali Asghar and Sakina. It is stated that he was with Imam al-Hussein from Medina to Karbala. And Tabari makes him a very important narrator. This individual, you find that he was wounded on that day, but because he was a slave, they let him go. Another individual was an individual by the name of Ad-Dahaq al-Mashriqi. Ad-Dahaq al-Mashriqi, he meets Imam al-Hussein in his journey. And when he meets the Imam, he says, "Oh Hussein, when a point it comes that there is no more being saved for you, then allow me to go." On the day of Ashura, when Imam al-Hussein is alone, the Haq goes to the Imam and he says, "Oh Hussein, remember that promise you made to me?" The Imam says, "Anta fi hillin min bayati," that you are absolved from any bay'ah towards me, but oh the Haq, leave the land of Karbala. So you find in this manner, this is one group. But the fourth group are the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. And the chief amongst those texts is Ziyaratun Nahiya. You see, at one level, Ziyaratun Nahiya solves many issues the Maqatil couldn't solve. When you look at the Maqtal, the historical texts about the killing of Imam al-Hussein, they give several possibilities for the killer of Imam al-Hussein. They'll say that it was Shimar. They'll say that it was Khuli. They'll say that it was Sinan ibn Anas. They'll say that it was Hasin ibn Numayr. The question is, why is it that we say it's Shimar? The reason we say it's Shimar is because Imam al-Zaman in Ziyaratun Nahiya, he says, وَالشِّمَرْ جَالِسٌ عَلَى صَدْرِكَ وَمُولِغٌ سَيْفَهُ عَلَى نَهْرِكَ وَقَابِدٌ عَلَى شَيْبَتِكَ بِيَدِهِ وَضَابِهٌ لَكَ بِمُحَنَّدِهِ. That Shimar was upon your chest. And Shimar was the one who was slaughtering you. You know, the first line, it says he moves his saif towards you. You know, a saif is a sword that you use in battle. But it says, "O Hussein, dabihun laka bimuhannad." When you were being slaughtered, it wasn't a sword of combat, but it was a dagger, because a dagger is what you use to cut something which is difficult to cut. No, at the second level, there are many masaib in Ziyaratun Nahiya which are not mentioned anywhere else. You know, you've heard that after the Imam was martyred, his body was trampled. But Imam al-Zaman in Ziyaratun Nahiya says, Imam al-Hussein was alive. The horses were going over the body of Imam al-Hussein. حَتَّى نَكَسُوكَ عَنْ جَوَادِكَ فَحَوَيْتَ إِلَى الْأَرْضِ جَرِيًّا تَتَاءُقُ الْخُيُولُ بِحَوَافِرِيَا. That, O Hussein, you fell on the ground wounded. And when you were wounded, the hooves of the horses would go into your body. But no, there is one masaib which the Imam gives about the women of Ahlul Bayt. You know, you've heard in the Maqtal that the arms of the women were tied with ropes. But Imam al-Zaman says, no, there is a different reality. He says, وَصُبِيَ أَهْلُكَ كَالْعَبِيدِ, that, oh my grandfather Hussein, your family was captured like servants. وَصُفِّدُوا فِي الْحَدِيدِ, and when they tied you, it wasn't ropes, but rather it was iron chains that had tied you. And then it says, مَغْلُولَةٌ أَيْدِيكُمْ فِي الْأَعْنَاقِ, and when they tied your arms, those arms weren't just tied to each other, but it was upon your necks that they tied your arms. You see, in this manner, the family of Ahlul Bayt is taken from Kufa to Sham. You know, Imam Zainul Abidin has a riwayah that he describes how they were taken to Sham. He says that when we were taken to Sham, all of the women were upon mules that had no saddles upon them. That he says in front of us were the heads of the shuhada, and from all directions we were surrounded by the army of Yazid, and they would point their arrows towards us. Whenever any one of us would cry, they would take those arrows and they would begin to poke at us. In this manner, you find Ahlul Bayt, they reach Sham. You know, Sham is that Masaib that when Imam Zainul Abidin was asked by Minhal that what was the most difficult moment, the Imam, he says, Ash-Sham, Ash-Sham, Ash-Sham. That, oh Imam Zainul Abidin, what happened in Sham? It stated that Ahlul Bayt, for several hours, they would stand at that entrance to Sham. And it stated in one riwayah that they would hang the head of Imam al-Hussein on the door of Sham. You know, when Kulthum, she sees that head hanging, she says, Wa Jadda, Wa Muhammada, Hada Ra'su Habibik al-Hussein maslubun. That this is the head of your Hussein, O Rasulallah. That they have hung the head of your Hussein, O Rasulallah. After that, that moment it comes when they enter into the bazaar and the marketplace of Sham. You know, Imam al-Baqir, he says that when we entered Sham, people would yell that these Baghi and rebels have come. People would throw rocks at us, that they would celebrate, and they would pour boiling water on us from the roofs of their houses. One point it came that they poured boiling water on my father Imam Zainul Abidin, and at that moment the turban of Imam Zainul Abidin would catch on fire. You know, when they were in the court of Sham, there was a companion of Rasulullah by the name of Sal ibn Sa'd as-Sa'idi. Sali comes to Imam Zainul Abidin and he says, I was a companion of your grandfather. Is there anything I can do for you? The Imam says, Oh Sal, bring me a piece of cloth. The moment Sal heard this, he says, I didn't understand. Why does this man want a piece of cloth? The moment Sally brings that cloth, Imam Zainul Abidin, he takes that cloth and he places it within that chain in his neck. And he says, Oh Sal, from Kufa to Sham, this metal has been burning my neck. You know, then that moment it comes when Ahlul Bayt, they enter the court of Yazid in Sham. When they enter the court of Yazid, it stated that there was a wife of Yazid by the name of Hind. And when Hind, she sees this caravan, she says, Min ayyi biladin antum, which city are you from? They say, Nahnu min bilad al-Madina, that we are from Medina. The moment that they said Medina, Hind, she sits on the ground. She says, I used to be a servant in a house in Medina. Sayyidah Zainab says, which house was that? She says it was the house of Ali and Fatima. The moment she said that, Sayyidah Zainab says, do you know anyone in that house? She says, I know Hussein, I know Zainab. Sayyidah Zainab says, oh Hind, do you see that head? That head where your husband, he takes a stick and he begins to hit the teeth on that head. That is the head of Hussein. And oh Hind, I am Zainab. That what did Karbala do to Sayyidah Zainab? ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون مات من حسين